I want to bring in John Wonderlich right now. He's the policy director for the Sunlight Foundation. Couldn't be a better time to bring in somebody talking about transparency right now. In fact, with all the attention being paid to WikiLeaks, this is something you were... Hello, John. Welcome. Good evening.
Hi. This
is something you work with all the time with journalists to help create transparent government.
That's right. We do work often with journalists. That's correct.
What do you think of this whole WikiLeaks thing?
Is
that Gov 2.0?
In a sense, it is, and I think that this is a great point in the conversation to talk about WikiLeaks because it's an example of both a step forward and sort of a complicated step. And I think when we look at what's been happening recently with WikiLeaks, it's a reminder to me that we've got a lot of work to do to figure out where the web is leading us and where this new technology is taking us. So the internet. There's the old saying that the internet views whatever it is as a failure and then routes around it. And in this case, we have the full force of the internet and the public versus the United States military. And those are two very enormous forces. And when they come in contact with each other, it only takes a few people that want to leak documents and someone with the know-how and the reputation for being able to anonymize documents to have suddenly an explosive and potentially very transformative situation. And I don't think that there are any simple opinions about WikiLeaks, but I think that in a sense, that's characteristic of a lot of kinds of Web 2.0 or Gov 2.0 things that are happening now. The way technology is transforming government is not going to be simple. And so there's a lot of work to do to sort out what policies need to change and what the future is that we're going to find ourselves in soon, are already.
Can you give me an idea of some of the projects you're working on along these lines?
Sure. So the Sunlight Foundation is focused on getting government to release more information and build the tools and databases and policies that lead to a more open and transparent and accountable government. So a great example of that is the site that we recently released called transparencydata.com, which is the first site where you can search for campaign contributions and lobbying records from the federal and the state level. So that's one website that we put together using information from the government, distantly from the government, and then from the National Institute for Money and State Politics, a state-level organization, and the Center for Responsive Politics, a federal-level organization. And then we took that data, put it into a single database, and made a web page where you can search for this information. So all the government agencies that are responsible for releasing this information don't do a good enough job. And so third parties like the Sunlight Foundation are necessary to try to get them to do a better job and also to fill in the gaps until we can get them to fulfill their role.
What else are you working on? And this is actually amazing. I'm sorry, I was trying to play with the database.
So my favorite project, I loved it when you guys were taking the C-SPAN feed during the healthcare debates, I think it was, and showing the campaign contributions to each speaker.
Isn't that a great boy? Talk about transparency there.
Exactly.
Who's paying for that?
I wish we'd see that on CNN. And
why don't mainstream media organizations do that? Are they afraid of biting the hand that feeds them? This data is so important, so valuable.
Well, there's certainly an aspect of corporate media being corporate media, but I think separate from that, I love our Sunlight Live project too, and part of that is that my personal love for the internet, I think personally there's a history with myself of resenting television and the way that it turns you into a passive viewer. And when you look at television, the sort of bandwidth that you get when they show Speaker Pelosi, they'll have the little blurb next to her says, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, speaker since X year, or from California. And that's the context that they're able to provide. But in order to really evaluate what's happening in often a very complex discussion, which is happening in Congress or across government, the sort of context that you need is far deeper than that. So what we started playing with our Sunlight Live tool was displaying, we were calling it data jamming. Somebody at Sunlight came up with that. And the idea of data jamming is sort of like culture jamming, is that when politicians are giving you a message, at the same time we're displaying who's giving them money or what the text is of the report that they're citing. And experimenting with the idea of real-time context for data. Because we think a big part of the future of the internet is real-time online disclosure of information about what the government's doing. And all of our regulatory systems, all the important essential things that the federal government does, many of them are built on disclosure, but the way that disclosure has worked historically has been ineffective. It's the kind of disclosure where, in order to see the filings, you have to go to an office in some regional office in the Gulf of Mexico. So when the oil spill happened, we discovered all these filings that happened for all these public reports that had to be filled out before any oil drilling could happen. And if you look a year ago, the public, last summer, the public was completely absorbed with the idea of whether or not offshore drilling should happen. And if you look at that whole intense public debate that happened, at the same time, there were fraudulent reports being filled out that said, where BP was saying that they were taking into account whether or not walruses would die in the Gulf of Mexico. And obviously, there are no walruses in the Gulf of Mexico, but those reports turned out to be completely fraudulent and false. Yeah.
You know, I just bought it. I just went right with it. You know,
yeah.
Oh, sure, walruses. Yeah, must be a big problem.
So the shame to me here is that our national conversation couldn't have been more focused on oil. And at the same time, our public disclosure system that was supposed to create accountable drilling was completely disconnected from it. And it took the nation's biggest environmental disaster and investigative journalists to find that. So if disclosure was working, that would have been discovered before there was ever an oil spill.
Do you see yourself as journalists, as a tool for journalists? What do you see Sunlight Foundation? Or are you some hybrid thing?
We are a crazy hybrid. We're an organization with investigative journalists. We have a big team of technologists, especially for a nonprofit. We have 15 or 18 technologists in Sunlight Labs. We're also, I'm technically a federally registered lobbyist, so I also lobby and meet with policymakers in Congress and in the executive branch. And we also do public organizing, too. So a lot of different things going on.
So a really good point here when you say you're a registered lobbyist. It really brings home the fact that in a democracy, there are a lot of different voices who could be considered lobbyists, and some of them are working for what we might consider big bad corporations, and some of them are working in the public interest, like you are. Yeah,
the big transparency, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, Sunlight Foundation, Sunlight Labs in particular, is known, you know, in sort of the community that coalesces around Code for America, really, as the center for hackers who want to do stuff with that data. So, in fact, we're often confused with Apps for America and Design for America, which are the two apps contests and a design contest that Sunlight Foundation ran that have just had a huge impact and really been able to show to the world what people can do with this data that's beautiful and interesting and useful and really spawn this whole movement.
John, who funds Sunlight?
So,
Big
since
oil.
we're called
I thought so, but I was just checking. Walruses.
So since we're called the Sunlight Foundation, you can read about all of our funding on the website. But our biggest funder is the Omidjar Network, which is
Pierre, one of the real good guys.
Yeah. Yes, you guys know it. So Pierre Omidjar, who's famous for eBay. Yeah. So that's where most of our money has come from, but it's all on our website.
And we just borrowed your About page and did our exact same contributions, by the way.
I
So
think
we're
that's a
following
great
your
idea.
model, and our funding also comes
Transparency.
from Omidjar and Knight.
Yeah.
Great.
So you don't have an agenda then, John. There's no agenda except transparency.
Well, so I'm responsible for writing an agenda about what the government should be doing differently, but no, it's specifically about openness and accountability in government.
It's not particularly partisan.
No, we are nonpartisan. We have a lot of allies on the right and on the left, and sometimes this is the one issue that they agree with. If you look at, for example, the Coburn-Obama bill, so now President Obama and the notoriously conservative, sometimes called Dr. No, Senator Coburn, joined together to pass a bill that we cared about very much that created the first database of federal grants and contracts. So we often see both sides of the ideological spectrum coming together around transparency.
You have an agenda. It's to make government transparent and accountable.
Exactly.
That seems a fair agenda. John, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's great to talk
Thank
to you.
you.
I had the wrong URL at the beginning. It's sunlightfoundation.com. .org is something else. Thank you, John Wonderlich. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, John.